with homelessness, it teaches you that you're different and you don't really matter. It's just really insidious the way you take things on subconsciously when you're in that frame of mind.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Story Building, where the storytellers come on to talk about their stories. Today's guest is founder of Beneath the Surface, which offers coaching and workshops on the topics of domestic abuse, homelessness, obesity, and more, as well as the author of The Black Mask, a memoir of, well, your life going through those exact things. It's Matt Vapor. Hello, and welcome to One Story Building.
I think, thank you, Cody. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no, it's my absolute pleasure to have you. So, of course, we are going to get into the story of your life. But first, we, of course, have to talk about you writing your book and starting your company based on experiences of your life, because these were quite traumatic events in your life. And it seems so logical for people to forget the bad elements of their past. But you had to do literally the opposite when you were starting your company, writing your book. So how do you and how do you think other people should go about bringing up bad elements of their past, if they should?
Yeah, look, that's a really hard question straight off the bat.
Oh, damn,
But
sorry.
it's all good. It's all good. Um, I think for me, because I had run away from the issues that my past had created for so long, it got to the point where I had no other choice than to confront them. And I guess, like, you can only run away from things for so long until they start rearing their ugly head. And for me, like, there's been a lot of, like, although I've been through some extremely traumatic things, for me, what's made me really relieved that I started confronting these sorts of things is the issues that pop up now that I've started to deal with them. So, for instance, because of the violence that I faced while I was growing up and while I was sleeping rough, my wife and I have to go through IVF and those sorts of things. So if I wasn't already dealing with them, I think I'd be in a much worse space than I would be now, being able to cope with those issues. So for anyone that out there that possibly has things that they need to confront, I think basically try and use my example of the things that, facing now, that the consequences of things that happened 20 years ago for me.
And your company, Beneath the Surface, can you give us a brief detail as to what that is and what was your motivation behind starting it from the start?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that caught up with me with trying to run away from my past was trying to be a functional human being in society. I found that I was struggling at a lot of things, and the more I ran away from my trauma and the things that I faced, the harder it was to actually function and have a job and pay my bills and all those sorts of other responsibilities that come along with that. And unbeknownst to me, like, I had undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, which I, because of running from my past, I never had it diagnosed. So not only was I struggling being a competent human being, I didn't realize that I was being massively triggered by pretty much everything around me. And it got to the stage where I was at my job and working as a librarian, because that's my actual profession. And what I didn't realize is that it was triggering me every day, and I had no idea how to go about that. I was waking up really scared to even leave the house at one point. And, from there I had to, I resigned from my job, which I really didn't want to do, but I had to resign from it. And around the same time, I was frequenting a gym quite a bit, and they sort of knew about my background as far as mental health goes, because by that stage I'd already started confronting some of the issues. And they asked me to come in, and they invited me in to do a talk, and I jumped at the idea. I'm fairly okay with public speaking for some reason, even though my past, it's a very unique combination. But yeah, I did the talk, loved it, and with the support of my amazing wife, managed to start my business and do it full time. Now that I, obviously didn't have a job, and from there, like basically beneath the surface is, as the name suggests, it's just taking the complex issues that I faced and having, people look beneath the surface and see what's actually behind them. So it might be mental health, it could be homelessness, it could be domestic violence or domestic abuse, and seeing how those things impact someone over time. So I use my own life as an example of how homelessness has affected me, how domestic abuse has affected me, how being a male sort of compounds those sorts of issues as well. And yeah, sort of using my life and the things I've experienced as an example. And the things that, the people that I work with, like through libraries or, through general public or other organizations, being able to use my experiences through this business as well is incredibly liberating, incredibly liberating. Being able to talk about my issues in front of, rooms full of strangers seems daunting, but it's something that I actually love to do because it removes the negativity from me. And I also get to meet people that have experienced similar things. So it makes what I thought was abnormal seem more normal because I'm meeting people every day that have experienced similar sorts of things.
Yes, sometimes we don't necessarily need our problems fixed. We just need to know that we're not the only one.
100%. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, a shared experience makes it a lot easier for whatever reason. And there's like this terminology, that I think it's called like real recognizes real. It's like really big around like hip hop and rap circles. And I think for a lot of like, I like to refer to that through trauma. If you meet somebody else with trauma, it's like you really recognize that person. And being able to identify with that person. I think that's a really powerful thing for people that are healing. For myself, it's been massive.
You mentioned that you being male was an important factor behind what you're doing right now, and I actually was able to find a quote from your book, The Black Mask. You graciously offered me an early draft of that book, which is one of the many perks of me doing whatever it is I do here. I've got a quote right here,
Yeah,
and I'm going to say it, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay,
yeah. Yes.
Quote number one. With what I encountered as a child, gender played a large role into the formation of my black mask. Men are conditioned to be silent about our emotions, no matter what we experience. It's a gendered specific cultural role we assume. Essentially, it's a destructive process of masking and suffocating how we feel and how we regulate our emotions. Now, people have been asking this question for decades, if not at least a century. Why do you think men so rarely talk about their feelings?
It's something that really pains me, and I wish I knew where it came from. I think possibly toxic masculinity, possibly back in the day where we had to assume that role, and maybe when we're cavemen and cave women, I should say cave people, we possibly had to assume those roles because we had to. And I think that's something that stayed with us while we evolve. The thing that I found most troubling though is particularly for men is we learn a lot by osmosis from other men. And so, if we see men not talking about things, chances are we're not going to talk about things. Whereas if we see more men starting to talk about these sorts of things, then other men will learn that it's okay to talk about these things. And yeah, it's just about removing that, that suffocation for a lot of us. And I think for most men, it's still incredibly hard to talk about things that we find emotional. Which is incredibly sad in its own right.
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that society, and I think men at least instinctively know this, that men are viewed as equipment in society, where a man is loved and appreciated if he can do something. And I'm sure that you ran into this when you eventually had to sleep rough. I mean, if I'm sorry if I'm being presumptuous here, but I would think that you felt somewhat invisible because you were viewed as a man who couldn't do something. Therefore, you are shunned from society. You are unseen. You can't be used for anything. So there was actually a men's group, for lack of a better word, that I went to one seminar that they were doing a couple of years ago, and I was surprised by how much the men were talking. They were talking about their feelings because there was an actual place, and they were accepted, and they were asked to talk about their feelings. And it was, I think we actually had to get stopped from talking because we were talking so much, because I guess this just never really happened before. I just don't think men have many opportunities and aren't granted many chances to just talk about their life, because it's not really seen as being useful, and men need to be seen as being useful.
Yeah, 100%. And I think as well, like you demonstrated it really well there, like when we're given the opportunity and the safety to be able to do it, you know, we can do it. And I think that group that you're talking about is like how I view our society as a little microcosm. Like we just need more men to be able to say, yep, you can talk about these things. Yes, I'm talking about these things. You know, we can talk about these things. And, you know, the more that we do that, the easier it's going to get. But yeah, 100%. I think men, I don't think it's just society that puts that view of utility on us. I think we also put it on ourselves. And I think it's just something that's, you know, reinforced throughout our life. You know, we're sort of raised and graded on our earning potential going through school. And then, you know, we're told to work, we're told not to feel, we're told not to cry. You know, we're told to just get things done. And, you know, there's a certain point where that is not going to work anymore. And I think for a lot of us, we're at that point now.
You mentioned school life and how that might affect young men growing up. Going by your book, you had quite a tumultuous school life. I've got some questions here about it, but do you mind just giving us a quick rundown as to your primary school and high school life and how that turned you into who you are?
Yeah, my primary school initially was really good. The school that I was going to. So up until about the age of 9, I was raised in Victoria, and the school that I went to was great, and you know, it was a fairly good environment. However, when my father chose to move us to WA, I had real trouble adjusting to the school, and you know, I had a horrific teacher. This was a year 4. I had a horrific teacher he should never have been teaching. And I think that coupled with everything that was going on at home with domestic abuse and domestic violence, I just wasn't able to learn. And yeah, from year 4 onwards, I started failing primary school. And it's really sad looking back on it, particularly writing the book, you know, being able to reflect on it as an adult, you know, all the things that were missed that were going on, all the opportunities that, you know, not only teachers had to intervene, but the people around me, you know, the other adults around me. By the time I got to high school, it was almost like I was a lost cause. I think I think I had already fallen through the cracks. I think my education was stolen from me with regard to everything that I was going through. And the high school that I went to was just extremely violent. It was a violent environment. And I chose this basically on the first day to embrace that violence. You know, I was already a victim of it at home. I didn't want to be a victim of it at school as well. So I started embracing it. And I should say that, you know, I've always hated violence. It's almost like my soul was my own enemy while I was being violent. But yeah, it felt like everything that I was doing, everything that had led me to that point was telling me that violence was good and I needed to be violent to be left alone. Yeah.
I was most intrigued by your referencing of apparently the first fist fight that you were in high school during a school camp. And I've got a quote here, and I'll say it right
Yeah.
now. This is at the end of you describing that you had the fight. So it felt like the fight ended naturally. I can't even remember a definitive ending. Maybe both of us just hurt each other enough and gave up, or we were both tired. And it's clear there that a physical fight, at least in that context, is more than just hurting the other person. So from your experience, socially speaking, philosophically speaking, when two people in a context like that have a fight, what exactly does that mean? What's actually happening between these two people?
For that example, basically it was a fight to ward off other fights, if that makes sense. So the environment that I was in there, it was almost leading up to that fight, there was something that was seen as disrespectful to me, and it felt the conditions within the school made me feel like I had to retaliate. And it was almost it was really sad in a way, because like we're at that stage, we're both 12 turning 13, thrown into this violent environment that we feel like we have to do this. And it just felt pointless, but it was just absolute aggression for the sake of aggression, to almost like pose that you're violent, and almost to pose that you're you should be feared and intimidated. And that would have been from the person that I was fighting as well. Like it wasn't as if I had anything personal against the person that I was fighting at that time. Like we ended up almost becoming friends. Like we're actually friends on Facebook now, believe it or not. But like it's just a really sad environment. And I think when that becomes the normal at the age of 12 and 13, it's a really hard habit to break. Those instincts to just fight when something's hurt you or something's disrespected you. It's really hard to untrain the mind to go from that. And I found in later life, even now, it's something that I need to be hyper aware of because of the situations that I was put in.
Violence is a very peculiar thing, because it's, off the top of my head, the only thing that we use more of to stop it from happening. Is that you use violence to stop violence. It's like poisoning a poison. Strange.
Yeah, exactly. And it keeps escalating. And in my experience, like whenever I've used violence, it's just because it's the situation's always getting out of control, and it's almost like you're trying to extinguish a fire with petrol. Like that's exactly what it feels like.
Would you have considered yourself back then, or thinking back retroactively, would you have considered yourself a bully in high school?
I wouldn't have considered myself a bully, but I definitely did bully. Looking back, I definitely didn't stand up for people as much as I should have. Other boys that were in the same situation that couldn't fight back. There were times where I did, but I wish there was times where I actually took that initiative and done it more. Yeah, definitely bully. I felt like, particularly the first instance of violence that I undertook at school, that was definitely bullying. Because I just straight up attacked someone. Although I had say my first fight was at that camp, I ended up attacking a boy during lunch, probably within the first week or two of school, just to send a message that don't mess with me. So that was I definitely was a bully.
Something that was very clear when you're describing your life in school is the complete lack of teacher involvement in pretty much everything. Fights would happen and teachers, for whatever reason, just wouldn't get involved. And I've seen my fair share of anti-bullying campaigns, and I'd say for the most part, they're kind of half-hearted and not really used effectively. I'm very skeptical of the usefulness of anti-bullying campaigns or anti-bullying sentiments, because I think because people are lazy, anti-bullying campaigns just turn into anti-bully, as in we just bully the bully until they're not a bully anymore. Uh, what do you think needs to be done to, well, just handle bullying in schools?
Um, I think from a male perspective, it would definitely help if we started breaking down those barriers and talking about our emotions more. I find that a lot of male orientated bullying, especially in school, is from that perspective, whether, one boy feels threatened by another boy, or whether one boy is jealous of another boy and doesn't exactly know how to articulate that. I think that's the first step to breaking down bullying. The second one is, I think, just having real conversations, like whether that's bringing in, people to speak on the subject that have experienced it. Whether you get people that were previously bullies coming in and speaking about it. Kids know when you're full of shit. And if you are coming from a place where you're trying to teach them about bullying, your heart's not in it, you don't really care, you're just going through the motions, they're going to pick up on that and they're not going to pay attention. So I think it's a combination of those two things to sort of try and break down, that barrier. Having said that, in my school, we didn't have any anti-bullying stuff at all. I don't even remember having even that being brought up, unfortunately. And I think in that sense, like, anything would have been better than nothing. Even if it just, shook one kid out of what we were going through, it would have helped.
I've got another book quote right here, and it might be my favorite part of the entire book. And here we go. All right. Looking back, I'm shocked at how ingrained violence and weapons were in the area I lived, how commonplace violent assaults were, witnessing people getting attacked for their shoes when I was 9, or having my first experience with a gun at 10. We'd even play games with weapons. One game we played was Crossbow Surprise, where we'd run around behind trees and an older child would fire arrows into the air over the trees. This was our normal, and when you're raised in such surroundings, it doesn't shock you at the time. I found that so fascinating, because what is happening there is terrible, but it had a certain order to it. There was a hierarchy to it. I mean, you describe it as a game, and I guess it kind of was. So from your experience, in experiences like that, how do these kinds of hierarchies within groups form in such violent areas?
Oh, wow. I guess it ultimately comes down to power, I guess. Like, for instance, when we were growing up, it was always the older kids that had some sort of power over the younger ones, particularly with these games that we used to play where, violence was just actually just commonplace. And it would always be the older, kids doing the violence to the younger kids. And I just think that's something that's perpetuated. Like, you're seen, you get some sort of seniority from age, but you also get some sort of seniority through the stuff that you face. And, well, for instance, as well, like the violence that you unleash. And it's not like a static thing. I think it can be fairly dynamic in those sorts of areas as well. It always seems to be, a lot of risk for not as much gain, particularly when you're looking in violent areas, particularly with whether it's youth violence or gang violence or any sort of violence. It's always a very high risk, little reward scenario.
You explain violence as having a debt in the book. Could you just elucidate on why you use that word specifically?
Yeah, I really dislike when people glamorize violence. There's absolutely no glamour in it. At the age of 40 now myself, my body is a mess from the violence that I faced and the violence that I unleashed. So that's one part of the debt, but it's also violence takes a toll not only on the victim, but also the person perpetrating it. There's never any escaping it. There's always going to come with some sort of debt. And it doesn't matter. Someone's going to have to pay for it in the end. For me, I live with the guilt of the violence that I've unleashed. I dream about it at night. I have nightmares about it. I have nightmares about the violence that I faced and that I experienced. There's always an element of debt, like, you could possibly, really hurt someone, and that's a debt. You could, live with a mistake for the rest of your life because you've taken something too far. That's a debt. And I think, we, particularly as guys, like, we live in a world where violence is, for some reason cherished, and it absolutely shouldn't. We should think of it as something that's extremely toxic, something that's has to be paid by someone, and that's where the debt comes into it for me. Like, I'll be living with the debt of violence for the rest of my life, whether it's through PTSD, whether it's through guilt, or whether it's through the physical effects on my body.
You explain in the book that a lot of, well, of course, this goes for pretty much everyone. A lot of what turns us into who we are because of our parents, who our parents are, what our parents are. And book quote again. Some say that we're created in God's image. I'd say we're all created in our parents' image. It might be culture, beliefs, norms, and values. They all come from our parents. More broadly, the image which we become is part of the bigger picture, which includes our siblings and parents. So when you were starting your company, writing your book, did you ever think that no matter how hard you try, or no matter how charitable you are in your efforts, what you do might still be somewhat cursed or tainted because you've still got the influence of being having a domestic abuse history with your family going on?
Well, 100%. It's something that I'm still working through to this day, and it's one of the reasons why writing the book has been so important for me, because I'm able to reprocess a lot of it and actually remove the veil that was there from when I was growing up. There's something really insidious about the power abuse has over us when we're young. It can be argued that it has a power over us no matter how old we are when we experience it. But I think when we're in an environment where we're growing up, the abuse is it's normalized. It's what we think is normal. And what I speak about in my book is that our parents, whether for good or for bad, they create our reality. They imprint onto us, what's expected of us, or how we should behave, what we think is acceptable responses to behavior, and how we go about daily life, and how we actually love our partners. And if you're raised in an environment similar to mine where that's extremely toxic, it can be incredibly damaging as an adult, especially when you're entering into relationships and stuff, to carry that sort of behavior with you. And you might be doing it unconsciously. I know I was. I do workshops on talking about how I went from like basically a scared boy to an abusive male. I started taking those things and just doing them out of complete normalization and habit, because that's the way I was raised. However, having said that, it's obviously no excuse, like it explains it, but it's definitely no excuse. And now, like, I'm even at 40, I'm still in therapy. I have a really great psychologist that I see at the moment weekly, to sort through these issues, because they're long lasting, and unless you're dealing with them in a real healthy manner, they're going to stay with you. And that can be incredibly toxic.
I'd like to talk now about your experiences with homelessness. However, I say the word homelessness and homeless yeah, just homelessness and homeless. But you've been using the term sleeping rough. Which one should I use? Is there a difference?
You can use either. There's just different sorts of homelessness. So for instance, for me, I experienced, the reason why I say sleeping rough is because I experienced two types of homelessness. The first was when I immediately fled the environment that I was in. I couch surfed for a little bit. That's a form of homelessness. But a majority of my homelessness was spent sleeping rough. So that's why I use that term. You can use either; they're interchangeable. Okay. But yeah, I just use that as a way, even in my own mind, to distinguish between the two periods.
So before we get into that, could you just give us a little description as to how you became homelessness, how you became homeless, and how you
yeah.
ended up sleeping rough, as you say?
Sure. So I dropped out of high school the first chance that I got, basically, and it was a mix of dropping out and getting kicked out, but that meant that I was at home more, and the home situation was really, really poor. You know, it was really toxic. It was just not a positive environment at all. And I had a girlfriend at the time, and she was the same age as me. Like, we were both 16, and my dad made a comment about her. She'd surprised me by coming around to the house, which was one of the things that I really didn't want to have happen because of the environment. It's like I wanted her not to be part of that environment at all. And yeah, my dad ended up insisting that he drive her home. And I, of course, accompanied her. And that's when, like, she went into a service station to get something. I can't even remember what it was for, but while my father and I were sitting in the car together, that's when he made like some really inappropriate comments about my girlfriend. And that was really when I think everything hit me. And like I drew a line, and he'd crossed it by doing this sort of thing to somebody that I cared about. You know, it was almost like he could say anything about me, but as soon as you do that to somebody else that I care about, that was enough. Unfortunately, things escalated pretty quickly, and by the time we ended up at my girlfriend's place, things like, I just wanted to get out of the car. I just wanted to get away from my dad. And by doing that, you know, her dad was outside, you know, witnessing everything that was going on, and that was pretty much it for the relationship, because he was just like, what the hell's going on? Like, what sort of environment is this? And my dad left me there, and I had to walk home. And you know, when I got home, I was like, I need to confront my dad about this. This is complete crap. And by the time I got home, it was about a half an hour walk. My parents were sitting there watching TV, and I ended up confronting him in front of my mother about what he said. And I used the exact terms that he used. And my dad went nuts at that point. He completely, you know, he was threatening to kill me. He was, you know, hitting me, punching me, wanting me to fight back. And I just refused to fight him. It was almost like in that moment, I saw him for who he was, just like a really weak man. And it felt like in that moment, like he couldn't do anything to me that would actually hurt me. And I didn't fight back at all. Like, I just didn't see the point in it. And I ended up leaving home that night. You know, my father was saying all this stuff, like just yelling that he was going to kill me, he was going to bury me in the backyard and such and such. And I remember at that point I was like packing my stuff, and, you know, I had my mum coming up to me saying, you know, don't do this to the family. And I think that quote probably pushed me out of their house more than anything else. You know, knowing that, you know, how my dad, or my father, I should say, was behaving, and, you know, what he was saying. And yeah, she was still saying for me not to do that to the family. yeah, ended up leaving. And yeah, that's basically how I became homeless.
When I was reading your book, there was never a point where you were fighting someone or doing the wrong thing, for lack of a better word. When things like that were happening, I wasn't thinking to myself, well, this person, Matt, this person is bad. They're a bad person. They're doing this bad thing because they're bad. Because I knew your history from the book. But you also bring up that people have to be held accountable for their actions despite what their past may suggest. So how do you find a balance between being sympathetic towards someone who's doing something horrible because you can assume or you know that they may have had a bad past, and holding someone accountable for them doing the wrong thing?
Oh yeah. For me, I separate the two by looking at half of it as explanation, and the other half as condoning. So on the one hand, you can explain a situation and you can get an understanding of why something has happened, but that doesn't necessarily condone it. So for me, I guess the example is, growing up in an environment where I was, neglected and abused at home. That explains why I was violent. Obviously, where it comes to being a teenager that was violent and through into my early 20s, being violent. However, I got to a stage where I knew that that didn't condone that behavior and that behavior had to stop. So although it explained it, it didn't condone it in my own head. And, part of what I do is to, going out and talking about my experience is part of that, because I feel like I owe it to people. I owe it to the people that I've hurt. I feel like I need to be 100% honest about that. And, I'm holding myself account for it, account for that behavior. Yes, like I grew up in a, bad environment, or, yes, I was, placed in a really violent high school that I didn't like. But at the end of the day, I still hurt a lot of people, and a lot of those people were innocent. A lot of those people didn't deserve it. And, I need to hold myself accountable for that. Although I can explain it, it doesn't condone it.
So you left your parents' place, you couch surfed for a little bit, but eventually you had to go somewhere where there wasn't a bed. How did it feel at that moment to finally make the decision that you had to make the decision to sleep rough? And where did you go?
Yeah, it was almost a slippery slope of just teenage naivety and just not really understanding the circumstances that I was in and how trapped I would actually be. So couch surfing for a little bit. I think it's also important to note that, the way that I had been conditioned growing up, particularly in a domestically abusive environment, meant that I wouldn't open up as much as I probably should have. So I think looking back now, particularly where I was couch surfing, I wish I had spoke up about what was actually really going on at home. And, maybe there could have been further intervention there. But yeah, like I thought when I was at the very last place that I was couch surfing at, I thought that I could just enroll in TAFE and sleep somewhere on campus. And I, just had this vision in my head that that's how it was going to be. And, it turned out to be very wrong. At that time, I couldn't enroll in TAFE. I didn't have any ID with me. I was underage. So back in the 90s, you needed parental consent to basically do anything if you're under the age of 18. And, the very first night that I slept rough, I was less than 50 meters away from my parents' house because that's just where I felt comfortable. It was almost like I instinctively went there because I knew what the area was like. I didn't think that I need to be close to my parents or I need to be close to the home. I just went there because I knew the area. And yeah, it's actually, looking back, it's incredibly scary how quickly you just get into that mindset of survival. And it's really scary how quickly the mind adapts to that.
So when you were sleeping rough, what were you sleeping on? Did you just try and find a comfortable bit of ground?
Yeah, basically. So like there was three things that I, looking back, that I really had to do. I had to find somewhere that was, safe, um, mostly hidden, and I had to be close to food and basically water. And one of the areas that I've frequented the most was a foreshore area, because there was like cafes and stuff there. There was jetties that I could sleep under. Um, but yeah, it's basically just finding a place to sleep that's somewhat safe, where you're not going to be attacked, or for me, I was very ashamed of what I was going through. I was ashamed of how I looked. I was ashamed of how I smelt. I was basically ashamed of everything. So as much as I could, I'd remain out of the public eye. So that would also factor into where I chose to sleep. Um, you know, yeah. You you can never really find anywhere that's comfortable, that's for sure. You just find places that are more comfortable than others. If you can, sort of have something in between you and the ground, that's better. If you can be off the ground, that's even better. Um, but yeah, it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to try and find somewhere to sleep. That was probably the hardest thing that I had to sort of decide, um, amongst other things.
How often did you move around to different places to find a place to stay?
Not very often, to be honest. Like I spent probably 90% of the time at the beach. And there'd be different places that I'd stay there, but once I had chosen basically that area, that's where I frequented the most, and I basically slept there the whole time. Um, what you'll find with the homeless community is, you know, they'll like, well, when I was homeless, it was almost like, calling dibs on places to sleep that you knew were fairly safe. So if someone had gotten there before you, then it was, you can't impose on that space. You need to go find somewhere else. Sort of like an unwritten rule, unless you knew the person that was there, or you had some sort of familiarity with them. So generally, one favorite place that I had was, under a really big jetty. And I try and get there as often as I could. But if that was already taken, then, I'd have to go somewhere else.
So when you're looking for a place that has something above you, I think to myself, well, so when you're sleeping rough, you're thinking, okay, I need to find a place where there's food and shelter. And I think, okay, shelter. Shelter protects you from the rain if it's raining, and if it's cold. It also protects you from harsh sunlight. But in my ignorance, I can't really think of any other reasons why shelter would be in amongst the category of needs like food. So when you're looking for why do you need something to be above you when you're sleeping rough?
Um, I wouldn't necessarily say you need something above you. There was, times where I was just sleeping out in the dunes, but particularly with the winter months, you definitely want something over your head. If you don't, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Just from the elements, it's amazing how cold it can get. So having that shelter over you definitely helps with that, particularly if you get wet, or anything like that. Um, I don't know. I guess it's also a safety thing. You just feel a little bit safer with something over your head. Um, it's an interesting, yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't been asked that before, but definitely during the winter months, I would say you want something over your head. Yeah, but yeah, that's actually really
Yeah,
interesting. I think, yeah.
Oh, it's like when having a blanket on you, like when it's a really hot night and you want to sleep blanketlessly and you can't because it's
Yeah.
weird to be open to the world. So you put like a little thin sheet of blanket on you to be protected. Like when someone's in
Yeah.
like a fire and they sit in the or like some horrible accident and they sit in the at least this is what movies and TV show me, where they sit in like the back of the ambulance and they put a blanket over you, not because they're cold or something. It's just like a nice, comforting little thing. I guess it's psychological and it helps, apparently.
Yeah, I guess so. Like had never actually considered that before, but yeah, it could possibly be like, that feeling like you just need that security blanket. Yeah.
So how long did this go on for? How long did you sleep at the foreshore?
Approximately about a year. I was either a year, just shy of a year, or just over a year, but I would say roughly a year. Like I definitely know I spent Christmas sleeping rough, and definitely New Year's I slept rough. And yeah, because sleep, yeah, I started sleeping rough just as it was getting uh, from cold to warm. That's how I can describe it. Because like when I was first sleeping rough, I remember how cold it was. And yeah. And then when I stopped sleeping rough, it felt like it was about the same time. Like definitely had gone through winter. But yeah, it was really hard to keep track of the days. Like I know I spent my 17th birthday sleeping rough, but I can't tell you what day that was. And that's the nature of it. Yeah.
That the first time where you have all the stuff that you have at the time and you sit down and you lie down and you think, okay, I'm going to have to lay on the ground and sleep. That's got to be a pretty intense moment. Like what thoughts are going through your mind when you think, okay, I'm just going to have to lay down and try and sleep if you can?
Yeah. I think that's the real dangerous thing. Like nobody knows that it's, like I just thought it was temporary. I thought like I was going to be sleeping rough for 1 or 2 nights maximum. Um, and that's the scariest thing about homelessness is you don't really realize that it has you in its grip so quickly. By the time 1 or 2 nights pass, like it becomes 3 nights, then it becomes a week, and then it becomes 2 weeks, and then you're just in this mode where you're just getting by, or you're just trying to survive, and you end up foregoing all your hopes and dreams. Like they barely enter your head, and it's just you just instantly go about survival. And as soon as you get into that mindset, that's when it's got its claws into you. That's when it's becoming normalized, and it's incredibly damn scary. Like
You,
looking back, like that's
yeah,
yeah.
you have to sacrifice your hopes and your dreams because all of your efforts have to be put on surviving because that becomes the most important and only thing that you can really focus on. But how do you survive if you can't buy a little bit of food? How do you survive?
Yeah, for me, like I was denied welfare because when I was the time that I was homeless was the 90s, and you couldn't get any sort of welfare support if you're under the age of 18 without parental consent. And although I had pursued that, and my parents had actually met with Centrelink, they denied any sort of payment. So when you've got absolutely no money and no way to generate an income, like for myself as well, like I didn't grab any sort of ID, because of the nature when you're fleeing those sorts of situations, you don't necessarily realize what you need at the time. I didn't even know where my birth certificate was, so it's not like that would have helped if I had realized anyway. Um, but you just don't realize how much these sorts of like little things can really lock you into a really terrible situation. So not having my ID, I couldn't go get a tax file number from the tax office, because I couldn't prove who I was, so there's no way I could go get a job. So literally the situation that I was in, either way, I'd be looking at least 2 years sleeping rough until I reached the age of 18 and were able to do things to actually generate an income. Up until that time, it was like I'd be in limbo. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Events transpired where I actually reached out for help, which, I'm forever grateful to the family that took me in. But yeah, it can be incredibly scary if find yourself in that situation and you've got absolutely no way of getting out of it.
Yeah, I've been wondering about this, and I don't know how to phrase this question in a way that doesn't come off as being just kind of dismissive and rude. When you reached out to these people after sleeping rough for about a year, why wasn't it, what was stopping you from doing this sooner?
That's the $1 million question. I think half of it has to do with conditioning. The way that I was raised, just not trusting anyone. Ultimately I had to be put in a position where I needed medical help to be actually, get into that I need help sort of thing. And, what happened to me on the last night that I was homeless, like I was deceived, into looking for some food. I was attacked pretty badly, and I needed medical attention. That is what made me reach out for help. It wasn't that I had enough or anything like that. It was just that purely that I needed medical attention. I really wish I had reached out to them. I wish I had trusted them, initially. I wish I had reached out to them when I was couch surfing. It would have saved me a lot of heartache, a lot of trauma, a lot of heartache. So, and I think as well, like with homelessness, it teaches you that you're different and you don't really matter. It's just really insidious the way you take things on subconsciously when you're in that frame of mind. And you pick up on how people treat you. You pick up on how people look at you. You pick up on the comments that people make, and that prohibits you also from reaching out for help. So I think for me, the reason why I hadn't done it earlier, conditioning, didn't trust anyone. I don't think I really was aware of the situation that I was in until it was too late as well. Didn't realize how bad the situation was. But also, yeah, I needed, it was almost like I needed that incident for me to reach out for medical help. And then that's when it cascaded into getting, off the street.
Off the street and eventually into an education, because you eventually then went to university. That's quite the inspirational story after all that. How really just how,
yeah,
how did that happen?
Yeah. I'd always felt like I'd had my education stolen from me with the circumstances that I was in. It wasn't that I hated learning. It was just like I felt like I was in environments where it was just impossible to learn. At the same time, I wanted to hide and run from, how I viewed myself. I viewed myself as a high school dropout, as someone that had experienced homelessness. I also wanted to run from the treatment that I received at home, being called stupid and dumb, and also the treatment that I received, particularly in the primary school, where I was, told constantly that I was stupid and dumb. And so I pursued education really aggressively. As soon as, the family that I reached out to, they helped me enroll in TAFE. And as soon as I got that enrollment, that was it. Like I hit the ground running, trying to educate myself because I wanted to push as far away from that image of myself that I had. I got myself through TAFE, and I got myself, I did a certificate 2, then 3, then 4. And then I ended up applying to an entrance program for university. Got into this sort of bridging course to get into uni. And then yeah, as soon as I got into university, it was almost like that changed my entire life. It was like at that stage I had shed the violent persona, and I'd been taught, a new way of being able to defend myself and being able to defend what I believed in. Instead of using violence, I started using words in essays and stuff, and I think that really like changed my perspective from that point on. And and it was like the further that I got through education as well, it was less likely that people would discover my past. Like, no one would ask what high school that I went to, or, those sorts of questions where, they'd leave me in a real awkward predicament trying to answer. Um, and, once I got my undergraduate degree in sociology and politics. So there was like plenty of arguing that I was able to do, and like persuasive writing. And that literally became my new battleground, like being able to do those really argumentative essays. And then from there on, I went and did some postgraduate studies and ended up getting my master's. And, it's something that was really effective in masking where I'd come from. But of course, like I hadn't done anything else in the background in regards to my mental health, which, although I was like fairly well educated by that point, the other things that I needed in my life, such as, robust mental health supports and those sorts of things weren't there. So I struggled.
So even though I've referenced specific passages from your book, I'd like to just ask you about your book, The Black Mask. What is The Black Mask, and why did you write a book about your life?
Yeah, I initially started out as I wanted to write a book for mainly other men to, help sort of uncover and confront domestic abuse and domestic violence in adult life. And that quickly changed. And now it's not just a book for men. I think it's a book for everyone that has experienced domestic abuse or domestic violence. And I think, although, the black mask might be different for all of us, I think, if we have experienced that, we all wear some sort of black mask. So for me, like, I wanted to describe how domestic abuse and domestic violence had made me feel. And it made me feel incredibly weak. It made me feel incredibly vulnerable. And the way I compensated that was molding myself into a instrument of fear, basically, through violence, through wearing all black, through, teaching myself not to smile. And I started doing all of this at the age of 13, really making that transformation into something to be feared. And that's where the black mask came from. Like, I just thought, like, something that strikes fear in a lot of people is like the balaclava. And for me, that's what, that was like what I could vision, how domestic violence made me feel. Like I needed something that not only instilled, fear in others, but something that also concealed the real me. So that's how I came up with the black mask. And I think, for a lot of us that have experienced any sort of trauma in that sense, we all wear some sort of mask to sort of hide that vulnerability in us, because, yeah, we don't really want that information to be public, or, we don't want others to pick up on that information. So we masquerade. And my way of masquerading was with terror, violence, and anger. And yeah, so that's where the black mask came from. Writing my book, it was, initially wanted it to be a self-help book. Then I realized that I'm still going through the process of healing myself, and that aspect of the book completely changed. So it was almost like a self-help book for myself just by writing it. And I really hope by writing it that people that have experienced similar things can get some healing from it. and that people that haven't experienced those sorts of things get a greater understanding on how these issues can affect all of us.
When you were starting beneath the surface and writing your book, did you ever think that you had to be nice and helpful, for lack of more complex words? It's like, did you think that you had a certain quota that you had to hit to pay off some of the bad things that you did in your past, to sort of rebalance the scales a little bit?
Not really, no. So I have this thing, the philosophy I have in life now is like, I just want to be a good person. That's all I want now. And I believe that was my true personality to begin with. That was the personality that I was born with, to be a kind, generous person. Unfortunately, the events throughout my life drove me in another direction, and now I'm able to reclaim that part of my personality. I feel best about myself when I'm helping others, not when I'm hurting them. And, that's something that I live by now. And, part of it's, the debt that I have to pay for the violence that I unleashed. But yeah, for me, like I'd been so conditioned through school and my home life and high school and homelessness to believe that I was a monster, to believe that I was different, to believe that, that I was just, a horrible kid. And, now as a 40-year-old adult, I realized that, no, that's not who I was, and that's not who I was ever should have been. I should have always been this nice, caring, generous person. And so now, like, I try to embrace that more through almost all aspects of my life. I try and be as nice as possible. And, it in some aspects, it feels like a complete 180 to who I used to be. But at the same time, it feels more natural than anything else I've ever done before in my life.
Yeah, I think that's truly what was in your core for your whole, just by reading your book. The fact that you stood up to your father in that final moment before leaving home forever, I think that takes a huge amount of bravery and kindness. So I think that was just always there, in my opinion.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. And speaking of that moment, like, as you've read, that's probably one of my proudest moments in life now. And I've only just realized that by writing, the way that I stood up to him and the way that I actually behaved at the age of 16 to a really abusive man. And it's something that gives me a lot of pride inside, although it led me down a path that I never want to experience again. In that moment, that's my proudest moment.
So what would you recommend someone think about and do when they're thinking about writing about their own life?
Like, for me, it's been the best possible thing that I could have ever done. If you're writing about your life, particularly if you're coming from a place where you've experienced trauma, for me, it's allowed me to reprocess a lot of things through an adult lens. So things that I hadn't even considered before, I'm now realizing. One of the main things that I realized was an interaction between my father and my high school when I was leaving high school. I was looking at I was about to be kicked out of high school, and it was the reaction that my father gave to the school, and coming into the school and being extremely abusive to the staff, that the school actually realized, like, I didn't know at the time, but the person that was kicking me out of school, once I grabbed all my stuff to leave, said, "You can always come back here if you need to." And I always thought to myself, what the fuck? You're kicking me out, blah, 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 blah. But I didn't realize until I looked at it through an adult lens that she realized what the situation was like at home. And she was telling me that the school was a safe place. However, having said that, like, it has been excellent for my own healing to reprocess a lot of it. The reason why I am seeing my psychologist though every week at the moment is because I am reprocessing it all. And I wouldn't be able to do it if I didn't have that support. And so if you're in a position where you're going to write about previous trauma, one, you need to be on top of your mental health. You need to have that mental health support network around you. And you need to be in that positive frame of mind, because even now there's things that are, not only is it incredibly healing, but it has at times really re-traumatized me to a certain point. So you need to have those safeguards in. But if you have those safeguards, I can't recommend it enough. For me, it's been a massive amount of healing in such a short period of time. The amount of reflection that it gives you, you like for myself, I've been reflecting on, real periods of my life that, I've never really reflected on before. It could be little interactions. It could be, little anecdotes that I hadn't thought of for years. And at the same time, I've rediscovered parts of it that I actually find, really funny and really humorous, and things that I can actually really appreciate during that time where I wouldn't have actually thought about them before.
There was a point in the book where you're talking about one of your school camps. I'm not sure if it's the one with the fight in it. It could have been, but you tell this story of how you, one of two things. You recorded sex noises onto a recorded and onto a recorder, and just walked around and played it around the camp while everyone was sleeping. And there was another time when a teacher had their bag of underwear stolen. And when I was reading this, it was such a contrast to all of the horror surrounding it, because I thought, well, he's writing this as part of this larger traumatic story. But I just thought to myself, this just seems like fun little goofy nonsense that teenagers would get up. So yes, goofy teenage nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. And I think back to that camp very fondly, although there was stuff I was quite actually misbehaving on that thing with some of the behavior that I did. But I think looking back at that time, that camp in particular, that was my year 10 camp. That was probably my most favorite moment of schooling. One of it was because of one of the teachers that we had, entrusting us to be able to go abseiling and that sort of thing. That was incredibly positive for me, like being in that position. But also, it just allowed me to reflect on that time where it felt like I was away from a situation that was incredibly negative, and I could just be that goofy kid, that was, that you do stupid shit and you can laugh at, later in life.
There was also a point in, I think that camp specifically where, and this was, I loved reading this because it was like a scene from a movie. I could hear the soundtrack in the background as I was reading it. There was an exercise that all the kids had to do where they had to write compliments to other students, and you did something. What did you do to those compliments?
Yeah, look, this is the reflecting, one of the things that come about just by reflecting on the situation. So we had this project where we, had to write these compliments and stuff, and I had and still have an issue with receiving compliments. They make me incredibly uncomfortable. And I was really fearful for two reasons. One was getting the compliments from other students. And two was probably the fear of not receiving any compliments. So it was almost like a double-edged sword. Like I was going to be damned if I received compliments, and I was going to be damned if I didn't. So I ended up basically taking everyone's little comment envelope that they had over a period of time, going outside and burning them. And it really sucks. How much guilt I have towards that. because everything else on that camp was extremely positive, but that just in that moment, it felt like I couldn't handle the compliments, and I couldn't handle the rejection of not receiving the compliments. And it was just incredibly overwhelming. It was just a spur of the moment decision. And yeah, something that I'm not necessarily proud of at all. But yeah, it's just one of those little things that feeds into a larger problem for myself, which is, the acceptance of compliments or concern or care or anything like that.
Right. Well, I liked reading that part in the book. I really like the book, but you don't accept compliments well. So I'll just say I'm indifferent towards everything that you ever do.
No worries. I'm really glad to hear that you've enjoyed it. I actually can't wait for it to be finished. There's still like a little bit of the way to go, but it's actually been a real joyous thing for me to do, and it's something that I have really enjoyed the process of. It's although it's been traumatic at times, it's been a really beautiful process for me to be able to reflect on those periods of my life.
And that, of course, brings us to the last question of One Story Building, which I always ask at the end here, which is, why are stories important?
Stories give us perspective. And I think without stories, it would be a lot harder for us to learn about different perspectives. My experiences have shaped me in a certain way that would be very different to the other, to a lot of other people. And I think without an avenue to be able to tell that story, a lot of people may never understand what others go through. So, whether it's something that's incredibly sad, incredibly traumatic, or incredibly happy, or incredibly delightful, being able to see those other perspectives is a real beautiful thing. And I think, stories in that sense, whether they're, fiction or non-fiction, are able to give us, glimpses into a world that we may never have imagined beforehand.
I'm always afraid of asking that question because I fear that people will just say the same thing over and over again, and then I'll just have to scrap asking that question. But every answer that I've gotten has been different, unique, and very, very special. So, Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
Like stories themselves.
Indeed, exactly. Yep, that's why I started this. You got it. Hit the nail on the head. And thanks for coming on to One Story Building. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.